This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, In Monsters We Make, journalist Rachel Corbett examines how power operates in the digital age, looking at the systems and incentives that shape online behavior and fuel harassment and abuse. She's interviewed by Alex Kotlowitz, professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Media, Integrated Marketing, and Communications.
One of the things that intrigued me about this book, and initially I was kind of befuddled, but actually I thought it was kind of genius, and we can talk more about this, but here's a book about criminal profilers, and right at the very beginning you kind of pop this myth about who they are and their capacity to really profile people. And for me, the book to me was, and as I read along, and there are all these stories I want to talk about, but it was really sort of more about the human condition, about how complex we are as people, and how inclined we are to reduce people to something very singular. And I don't know whether you see that as well, or
I think it's like, I see it as it's one realm in which fear is manipulated, which happens all over the place, where we're defining other people as a way to control them, and we're telling stories about things in order to control them, to make things more accessible for us and more palatable. So I think you probably see those big features of society in other areas besides crime.
But like even the first story you tell, and maybe you could sort of recount it about your mother's boyfriend, Scott, and which is sort of what brought you to this subject in the first place.
So this is I wrote the book and I hadn't written the introduction, and then my editor was like, why don't you write an introduction? And I was like, okay, what should it be? He's like, well, what made you want to write the book? And I wasn't going to write about this, but then I felt like the honest answer was, when I was a child, a man who my mother saw for a few years, ended up, shortly after they broke up, he ended up killing his next girlfriend and then himself. And I didn't know about the murder part of that till years later when I was in my early 20s. And I became kind of obsessed with trying to figure out how this guy that I had always thought was really gentle and kind and completely nonviolent could do something like this. And I kind of investigated it like, I don't know, a detective or maybe just a journalist. But I spoke to everyone around him. I spoke to the cops. I talked to sociologists, forensic psychiatrists. I met the boy whose mother was murdered that day. And pieced it all together, and he did kind of fit this demographic profile of the kind of person who commits murder-suicide, which is actually a very particular crime. They often haven't had a past of violent activity, but it didn't really feel like, it didn't really resolve my feeling of like, well, who is he though? What was actually going on in his mind when he did something like that? There's really no way to know that, and so it was just this kind of frustrating realization that I just had to kind of deal with the ineffable and just deal with that.
Right, and I guess that's what I'm getting at, is here's a guy who, on the one hand, you saw as this kind of very gentle, giving individual. I mean, you were with him for 2 years in the same house, and then he goes and commits this heinous crime, and trying to reconcile these two people is almost impossible. And maybe it is that people can hold both inside of them.
Yeah, I think that's the part that's so scary. I mean, that's Jekyll and Hyde. That's so many of Ted Bundy was seen as like a two-faced, or the monster within kind of narrative. Yeah.
But I don't think of Scott necessarily as a monster. I mean, he did something monstrous, but it sounds like I think I teach occasionally at Stateville Prison, and the guys I've been teaching have all committed violent crimes, and I have not looked up the crimes they've committed. But they're, for the most part, incredibly gentle, decent, kind human beings, deeply curious, and trying to reconcile that with what they have done, I think is maybe an impossible task. And for me, that's so much what I loved about this book. I thought about, I don't know if you ever saw the TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, the novelist, but it's about the danger of the single story, thinking we know people when in fact we know very little, that people are just really complex and multidimensional. But one of the things I loved about this book is just the stories you tell, and they're just beautiful stories. There are three of them that I want to talk about, and the first one is it Henry Murray? Is that right? Yes. So this is a guy who, if I understand right, was really not a psychologist. He was a doctor, and well, maybe you could tell, because he intersects with all these other people in the book as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say to your previous point that I think it's the urge to essentialize criminals is even more so the case. People are never just one thing, but also people need to define this evil quality as some essential thing you're born with, in a way that's particular.
Or see this sort of this linear line of good and evil.
Anyway, Henry Murray is so interesting to me. He's like you said, he was a physician. He was a surgeon. But he became very interested in psychoanalysis at one point, and he went to Switzerland and did a few sessions with Jung. And then I guess he kind of decided that he could do it too. And he went back, he was very connected, very wealthy, went back to Harvard and kind of just talked his way into leading the psychology clinic there. Really a kind of classic, charismatic kind of narcissistic guy. And so what he does is, with this enormous power he now has, is he ends up, World War II happens, he ends up working with the OSS to profile Hitler, which had not been done before. Now we do these kinds of leadership profiles all the time with people like Putin or whatever. But so he worked with the CIA and he read Mein Kampf and he analyzed all his speeches and he made some very specific predictions about Hitler's sexuality, but also what he thought he would do in the war. And he loved working with the military and with the intelligence agencies. So he had to go back to Harvard because the war ended, but he brought a lot of his research back with him. And he started experimenting on his own students. He wanted to figure out, he believed you could engineer personalities. But to do that, you kind of had to break someone down and then rebuild them in this very disturbing way. But he got to the breaking down part. He didn't ever get to the rebuilding. So he started trying to kind of break his students, and he did these humiliation experiments was one strategy. And one of his students was Ted Kaczynski, who was at that time 17 years old. He was a prodigy from Chicago, and it was there that he started having some fantasies about revenge and things go awry. Kaczynski, yeah.
And in fact, when Kaczynski is eventually caught, there's some speculation that the experiment that Murray had done on him had actually caused his spiral.
His lawyers were going to try to argue that case, but he refused to be. He didn't want to be represented. He didn't want to be psychoanalyzed. He hated psychologists, if you can imagine why. But I don't think it's any one thing that would cause something like that, but it certainly couldn't have helped. And
so what drew you to Murray initially? Was it?
I actually wanted to write a book about Murray. I was so fascinated by him. But what did I guess it was these experiments. And to me, he represents something in this profiling world. I conceive of profiling, kind of broadly, not just like the FBI, behavioral science, but how the CIA is using it in other areas. And he was that kind of classic example of somebody who was defining others, but when you look at who he was, it's kind of like, well, who is the sadistic person in this equation? Who is the one abusing the power? And by defining other people, he kind of gained it.
And with Hitler, was he, how close was he to guessing what Hitler was going to do? Did he?
He spent so much time on like his sexual desire. He was like, he said he studied 3,000 metaphors in Mein Kampf and decided that he liked women to urinate on him, probably. It was like, but he made a few predictions about the war kind of at the end, and he predicted that he would commit suicide, which was in fact true. He thought he would want to martyr himself before he ended up, would ever surrender. Right. So that part was, I guess, accurate. not much else.
But for me, Murray, is kind of in some ways, the anti-profiler. In other words, he sort of imagines that he can create people that he ultimately, because he's created, as you said, engineer their personality, that he'll know them and know them intimately. But he failed miserably at that, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And Kaczynski is kind of assuming that it had some effect on Kaczynski, is kind of a prime example of how it.
Yeah, I don't think he was actually so interested in understanding people as much as he was engineering people in the end. But.
And he intersects with this woman who ends up trying to understand Ted Bundy. Remind me of her name.
Dorothy Lewis.
Dorothy Lewis. And so Lewis, who had taken one of his classes, I guess, there wasn't, she didn't necessarily adhere to what he was doing, but she ends up trying to profile Ted Bundy, the serial killer.
Yeah, she was, not around the same time that Ted Kaczynski was there, she was there also and had taken a class by Henry Murray. She was afraid, she thought that maybe she could have been recruited to that study too, had things gone differently. So she's this really interesting, she's a child psychiatrist that comes out of Yale, and she was one of the first people to study juvenile offenders, teenage people who'd been, who'd done something violent. And she was really successful at compelling the Supreme Court to twice raise the age of executions. Because of her, we don't execute minors anymore, at least for now, I don't think. But so she then went on to start evaluating pretty much all the serial killers that were famous in this era, including Ted Bundy, of course. And she was really in the wrong time for her advocacy, because she was coming up at sort of as the culture wars were inflaming, and the religious right was really into evil as an explanation for all crime, and she was interested in understanding it from a medical and scientific perspective, and she didn't believe in the death penalty, for example. So she, people hated her because she would go to prison and try to get Ted Bundy off of death row, and she is so interesting to me because she kind of falls into this trap, though, maybe a little bit, where she becomes so obsessed with understanding Ted Bundy. She's still trying to figure it out. I went and visited her a few years ago, and her living room is literally covered with Ted Bundy's files and archives of. She's still trying to understand what made him tick, because he didn't fit the profile. He claimed to not have any childhood trauma or abuse, which is to her one of the completely necessary hallmarks to become violent. So she comes up with her own theory, which maybe I won't tell you because you can read the book, but she comes up with a theory that, because I think she has to solve the case. Whether it's true or not, I don't really know, but I think she can't accept that maybe she won't understand ever.
And there are two things about Bundy's story that I found just really intriguing. One was, there's a moment after she's trying to figure him out, and James Dobson, who founded Family Focus, comes and interviews him, and it wasn't clear to me how did he end up, and why did he end up interviewing Ted Bundy? I know what the result was, which we can talk about in a minute, but how do you find his way there? Do you know? So if you don't know James Dobson, just real quick, James Dobson, it's Family Focus.
Focus on the Family.
Focus on the Family, right. Very, very conservative organization, kind of predates sort of what we're seeing today in the cultural wars. But anyway, yeah, so.
Yeah, it was right when the Republican Party was fusing with Christian
evangelicals,
yeah. I don't know the process by which he actually got the interview with Bundy, but it was the last interview Bundy ever gave, and I can see why James Dobson would have wanted to do it, because it proved his work up to that point. He thought it would. His main issues were drugs and pornography. He was very anti-pornography, and Bundy was starting to claim that pornography had turned him violent.
So he knew that before the interview.
I think that they had talked about.
Okay.
I think that Bundy was whoever interviewing him wanted him to be. He would completely shapeshift. So I think that Bundy was very obsessed with coming off as normal, being seen as not a freak, and that's why he said his family was completely safe and fine. And so with this televised interview, I think Bundy probably saw it as an opportunity to, reclaim his sanity in the public eye, and he blamed somebody else for what he did, blamed pornography, something else.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of an amazing moment that that Dobson intersects. I mean, he ends up using the video of that interview, and it's sort of the beginning of his organization.
He makes a lot of money.
Yeah.
He starts selling the video, and he made the first $1 million for Focus on the Family.
And the other part about Bundy's case, which I didn't realize, is he was kind of the spark for the law and order period we saw in the 1980s under Reagan.
Yeah, he kind of put the FBI behavioral science unit on the map completely. They were famously these guys that started in the 60s who were working underground because nobody in the FBI respected anything psychological, and they were really like cops and ex-military guys at that time in the FBI. But this was sort of right after J. Edgar Hoover had left the organization in disgrace. So the FBI needed to rehab its PR, basically, and they started to drum up this idea of a serial killer epidemic. There was Ted Bundy, there was soon after that John Wayne Gacy, and the Atlanta child murders were all going on around the same time. And they claimed that 4,000 to 5,000 people were being killed every year by serial killers, when it was actually about 400 to 500. But it was more like, what is it? The 4,000 number was every murder that was going on. And no one corrected it. They went to the press and would say this. And then they would say, now that there's this horrific problem, we have the solution. We are the solution. And we have these mind hunters, these guys who are sort of these geniuses in the basement who can see into the darkness and like no one else can. And never mind, they had never solved a crime at that point, the profilers. They really didn't know what they were doing. Had maybe taken a couple psychology classes at most. But they presented it to the press, and the public was like, "Oh, great! We're terrified. Let's fund these guys." And they indeed went to Congress, got a lot more funding, expanded their jurisdiction, and that's why we know of profilers at all, probably.
I'm curious, have you heard from anybody with them since the book has come out, or
no?
Because it does take them to task. I mean, it does.
I know.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
I know. Well, I interviewed profilers for the book. Some of them very smart, interesting guys, but James Fitzgerald, for example, and he kind of came around to doing a different type of profiling. I think he acknowledges that it wasn't the magic it seemed.
So the book takes kind of a dark or cautionary turn towards the end, where you talk about how the criminal profiling has led to this idea of predictive policing. And you tell this story in Tampa, which I had to go back and reread again because it's so unsettling. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and about how criminal profiling has led to this idea of predictive policing and what we mean by predictive policing.
Yes. So in sort of calming society's fears around crime, we've always tried to sort of identify markers of the criminal, whether it was a phrenology in the 1800s when bumps on a skull could be corresponded to thievery or murder. Then, in the FBI era, it was behavioral cues, or even there was if you wet the bed as a child, then you might grow up to become a serial killer. So there's all these weird ways to essentialize this, and I think that predictive policing kind of logically grows out of this because it's another way, it's another new science, new technology that marks people as future criminals in some cases. So what happened in Florida is this really horrific story about a sheriff there who had developed this algorithm, if you can call it that basically looked at childhood factors associated with criminals. So because criminals often have things like they had an incarcerated parent themselves, or they were a victim of abuse, or they witnessed abuse in the home, they said, well, children who have those features in their lives should be sort of targeted for enhanced policing now so that we catch them before they do something awful. Of course, many children who have those life circumstances don't grow up to become criminals. And so I follow specifically one boy who was targeted starting when he was 15 And he was arrested so many times. Had to spend 30 days in juvie for each time he was arrested. He was never convicted of a crime, but he had to drop out of high school. He was kicked out of high school because of the truancy. He never graduated. He didn't go to college then, and afterward, I won't give it away again, but there was a kind of prophecy that was ultimately fulfilled.
Right. Well, it was a prophecy that was in many ways engineered by this sheriff. I mean, as you point out, the algorithms are often algorithms really that the police have.
Pipeline.
Right. Yeah. And for me, it was just a really unsettling story. And of course, you talk too about, we've seen this in Chicago, the CompStat, idea that major city police departments use statistics and algorithms to try to figure out who is likely to commit a crime. And of course, I think it's particularly dangerous, especially in this moment in time. But I mean, I'll state the obvious, but it just right away just leads to racial profiling and profiling of individuals from particular neighborhoods.
Yeah. And they keep evolving. Predpol was another one that did get pulled from a lot of cities because it was so blatantly racist in its effects. The one in Florida, they say it sort of targets people not by race, but class is certainly a factor. It's a really unusually large number of autistic kids who get lumped into this pre-criminal nature. Yeah, so but they keep evolving. In that case, a lawsuit happened and they were required to shelve the algorithm they were using, but now they just call it something like focused policing or something like that. It's just another name for it.
So I'm curious, we were talking earlier and you had said that you've been invited on a lot of fairly conservative podcasts, in part because of our obsession with crime and racial profiling. And I'm curious how they read your book, or maybe they haven't, and they're just kind of curious about.
They're like, the interviews are like, so Rachel, the criminal mind, what is it? Or is it nature or nurture? It's kind of the typical questions used. I don't think they've read the book. I don't know that they would like the book so much if they'd read it, but it's still about, tell us about the criminal mind, nothing really about the profilers, which is kind of how I wanted to flip the story a little bit.
Right. Yeah, and again, I think it speaks to kind of our inclination just as societally to try to reduce people, and people I think are just incredibly complex and filled with their own personal contradictions and ambiguity, and you talk about this at the end of your book. You talk about in fact, about your dad. Right, there's this, I mean, I have this one, you write, my father was a monster, and maybe we can talk a little bit about why you say this, which is to say a contradiction. Horror stories are filled with hybrids, Jekyll and Hyde, the living dead, and he was no different. The more I tried to picture him from one angle, the less I could see.
Yeah, well, I think about this, I mean...
And just to back up, your dad served some time in prison for being abusive to your mom, and
I just think that these monsters have become this patchwork. I'm calling them monsters, whatever, criminals, they're kind of Frankensteinian patchworks of things that you can project anything onto them you want to. And I mean, I had a similar feeling about my dad as I did Scott, and I wanted to understand something. It's hard when you love someone who's the perpetrator, because that's a contradiction, right? They're bad, but I think all these things are essentially contradictions in all of these people.
Right. And I mean, I think, I don't want to speak for you, but I think what you're also saying there was more to your dad than just this, what brought him to prison.
Yeah, certainly. And then, and then I was thinking about what my writing this about him or about any of this says about my own, the conflicts I have around that history. Am I trying to take control of this narrative to take control of a situation that had made me really helpless at one point in my life? What is the kind of meta psychology going on?
Well, it's funny, when I first read the title of your book, and the monsters we make. I think I misinterpreted it because I think what you meant is that it's the monsters we make in our heads. In other words, they're not necessarily monsters, but it's how we, and as you said earlier, thinking of people as monsters helps us in some manner or another. And yet people, I think, commit monstrous acts, but it's hard to think of people as really as monsters. And I think that's ultimately what you're getting at here.
Well, I like the word monsters because it suggests something fictional too, right. And it's a storybook thing. And there's really not that much difference with the way we construct serial killers or monsters in books. You know, we do similar things to them to monsterize them. And yeah, so we make, this is a little of the pushback I've gotten from the conservative media is a little bit of like, well, no, they did commit these crimes. It's not like we're inventing this idea that they're monstrous, but it's more like, how are we creating them as stories in the culture we're making them? And in some cases, maybe more literally. In the case of Kaczynski, I don't know, maybe there was a little more hands-on monster making in that story.
So why don't we open it up to questions, if people have questions for anybody? Or?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm sorry.
Oh, let me wait. Oh, we're going to get a microphone here. Yeah, so yeah, go ahead.
Is there anything good that can come from the profilers? Is there any way to use this like for benefit, for societal benefit?
Historically, when we talk about profiling as something like, it's probably a white man who's this age or this, I think maybe the best we can do with that is maybe it can help narrow down a field if you don't know where to start. It might give you a place to search. Like with Ted Kaczynski, they had no physical evidence whatsoever. So maybe ruling out groups, at least to start. But the problem is with so much of the prediction is just that people are, the police, everyone who's doing this work is always bringing so much of their own pre-existing expectations to it that it becomes really hard. I do think there's good research, psychiatric research, scientific research about, aspects of violent behavior that we can look at. But I think when you start bringing the policing part into it, it gets a little stickier.
But you think that, like, for example, if you can use a predictive whatever data, can you put programs against it?
What do you mean by programs? Like social
violence interruption, social services, job intervention.
Yeah, again, I think that is a better use of this information because I think it's the policing that part that becomes the problem when you start engineering people's futures based on what could be very faulty data. If this kid in Florida had been targeted and then given a counselor, I think that would have been great.
And I think Dorothy Lewis, actually, her work was really important in the end. Dorothy Lewis is the woman who sort of examined the brains of juveniles and came to the conclusion that one, they weren't as formed as adult brains, right? And some of them were actually damaged from trauma and
their brains could be physically altered, maybe during abuse or just whatever, car accident.
So I have a couple questions. One about this boyfriend of your mother who married with another woman and then killed himself and her. I understand that you explained something about it, but I sort of not. So what is the conclusion about this history? Could your mother also be killed before if he did not leave her? Or this was just some kind of, I don't know.
It was just a puzzle to me. Of course, it felt like a near miss for my own life. I would never have expected him to murder my mother, but after it happened to someone else's mother, of course I thought that could have been us. And in fact, I had seen him the day it happened, so there was a feeling of real proximity to that crime.
But you also said he was sort of normal.
Yeah.
And so you don't know why it happened with him with another woman.
I don't know why. I know what some of the studies have said. I mean, for example, murder-suicides often are perpetrated by someone who just lost a job, which was true in this case. It's almost always a female current or former romantic partner who's the victim, which was also true in this case. It happens to be a particularly rural crime. We were in Iowa. So there are certain things that, aspects that line up with the profile, if you want to call it that. But because he seemed normal to me, that became the question. What are we, in trying to rationalize this crime, what am I actually not able to grasp? Maybe I'll never be able to rationalize something like that.
Sure. And second question is, could you use this reverse strategy? For example, you have a publicly known person that didn't do any crime, or maybe did, whatever, but can you, by his statements and behavior, somehow delineate his personality that we kind of obviously cannot make?
No, I mean, to me, it's not clear because I don't know, I can't imagine what was going through his mind in that day. You're still talking about Scott, right? You're still talking about Scott, right?
No, I'm talking about anybody, for example, President Trump.
Oh.
That you want, so you have some trivial descriptions of his behavior, but these people maybe deeply look at his different statements of different times and tell you what is he really is about. Something, not necessarily him, I mean, anybody. It's just example.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, what they do, what the CIA does with their profiles of other dictators. They did it with Saddam Hussein and that kind of thing. People are doing it all the time with Trump. Psychiatrists aren't supposed to publicly diagnose somebody, but people.
Is it reverse engineering of what you described, that you have some signs of crime and you try to determine who did it? And here you know the person and what is really his intentions or something.
Yeah, that's what I was doing. I had we know who the perpetrator was in my case, and I mean that's just to me it's sort of we're still trying to identify them though. We're still trying to figure out who they are. Maybe one in a more literal sense of identifying the suspect, but the other is who are they really? What's going on inside them that tells you. If I understood your question, right?
It does make me wonder what the profiles are of Trump by foreign powers like China and Russia, and how they've come to see him.
So your case study sounded quite disparate. Could you say a few words about how you selected the particular research projects, and is there some thread linking the ones that you chose?
So it goes chronologically through history. It's not a history of criminal profiling, but it's sort of 5 episodes from within the profiling worlds that I see as representative of some aspect of it. So one is the CIA, one's the FBI, one is this new technology, predictive policing. One is in the era of Jack the Ripper and Arthur Conan Doyle. To me, there's a few threads. There's these themes of fiction and narrative that gets churned through, but there's also some literal narrative threads in that Henry Murray recurs in several of the chapters. He kind of has a hand in through them. But the first one and the last one are kind of on their own. They're sort of caps, and then there's. Do you think that they have anything in common? I don't know, with each other.
As I read the book, I mean, I feel like the book obviously is about criminal profiling, but I feel like really this book is and it's I think in some ways quite profound, but it really sort of speaks to the sort of complexity and of the human soul. I mean, it's just that it's such a mistake again to sort of reduce people to a single moment, to a single act, or even a group of acts, and that's kind of what I took away from it.
I was going to say that's what you do also in your own writing. I mean, yeah, I think that's a good takeaway. I like that.
Can I follow up? Speaking of threads, you also have written a wonderful book about the relationship between Rodin and Rilke. Are there any threads between these 2 volumes?
I think that I really like the idea of 2-person relationships, or how 2 people can shape and influence each other. So I kind of conceived of this book as each chapter is kind of a profiler and the profiled person. Whether they know each other or not, they're kind of creating, the profiler is creating an image of them. The profiled person is reacting within the constraints or the world that's been dictated for them. And so they're totally different subjects, obviously. But I think the sort of psychology of the two, I mean, what Henry Murray would call the dyad in this book is intriguing to me.
Great. So to end, what I'd often like to do is just to know what books you'd recommend that you've read over the past year, or authors that you've read.
I've read so much crime, but I mean, last year. I read it. Well, I recently read, I did a talk with this author, Robert Kolker, the other day, who I love. He wrote a book about the Long Island serial killer. I live in New York, so this was a kind of homegrown murderer that has just been caught, Rex Heuermann, well, allegedly caught. And he wrote a book about it called Lost Girls. But what I just read was his new book called Hidden Valley Road, which is about a family with six schizophrenic children. And that's a really amazing book. And it's kind of a history of schizophrenia as an idea, too. What else have I read lately? I mean, I read Dorothy Lewis's memoir, which is pretty fascinating about her life, her own feelings about violence. She thinks of herself as someone who could have easily become a murderer on the other side had she not had such a nice upbringing. So she talks about that as well as her research into juvenile violence. And whenever someone asks you this, you just draw a blank.
I know. I should have told you beforehand I was going to ask. I know, it's always hard,
I mean, I just read a novel, but
Which
I'm trying to read novels now that I'm done with, because you just read research for so many years.
I'm finding my respite and succor in fiction now, given the state of the world. But
I think it's going to have a comeback now.
Yeah, but I can't recommend this book enough. And one thing I'll say, it's a slim book, but it's absolutely packed. And each of the stories, I actually had to go back and reread. I mentioned that the story about Tampa, I had to go back and reread because it was so unsettling and disconcerting. But it's really just a beautiful book. So thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks.
If you like hearing nonfiction authors talk about their work, you should check out our America's Book Club podcast. Every week, author and philanthropist David Rubenstein talks with leading authors and cultural figures about their ideas and works. Find America's Book Club wherever you get your podcasts.